Good morning, everyone. My name is Casey Arnold, and I serve as the Vice President of Engagement for the University of Illinois Alumni Association. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate your support of our ongoing Alumni College Speaker Series, and we are excited to welcome back several repeat attendees tonight. But before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd like to take a moment to talk to you about some exciting online offerings from the UIAA that you can access from wherever you call home. First, if you're not already signed up, we'd like to invite you to join our online networking and mentorship platform, Alumni Link. You can visit alumnilink.illinois.edu to set up your profile and connect with thousands of fellow alumni from around the world. You can also join our online book club by visiting pbc.guru/uillinois. Joining the book club is free and provides our alumni with an opportunity to connect with one another over shared interests in literature, history, and professional development. And if you love the speaker series, please make a note to register for our next session, a Career Connections webinar featuring our partners at the University of Illinois Community Credit Union. Money Smart is scheduled for November 12th, so be sure to tune in if you'd like to learn some practical strategies for budgeting, avoiding overspending, and maintaining a strong credit score. On the membership front, we're excited to announce that our 2025 snow globes are here. This year's collectible captures Alked Hall in all its winter glory, complete with swirling snow and the sound of hail to the orange. You can grab your limited edition snow globe by becoming an annual or life member of the UIAA, or by purchasing a gift membership for your favorite Alumni. If you're already a member but would still like to receive a snow globe, you can receive a snow globe with a special $150 gift donation. All details are available at uiaa.org/membership-snowglobe. Finally, I would like to remind everyone to please submit questions during the presentation via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will have time left at the end for questions, and we will get through as many as possible in the time allotted. Also, if you are interested in reviewing this presentation at a later date, a recording will be posted to the speaker series section of our website within the next 10 business days. Now let's get to why we've all logged on tonight, which is to hear from another esteemed member of our Illinois faculty. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Brent Roberts. Brent W. Roberts is a professor of psychology, and at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, he holds the Gutzkel Endowed Professorship and a Center for Advanced Study Professorship. He is designated as a Health Innovation Professor in the Carle Illinois College of Medicine and is a distinguished guest professor at the Hector Research Institute of Education Sciences and Psychology at the University of Tübingen, Germany. Dr. Roberts received his PhD from Berkeley in 1994 in personality psychology and worked at the University of Tulsa until 1999 when he joined the faculty at the University of Illinois. And with that, it's my great pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Roberts.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Casey. It's good to see you, and it's nice to be here with the alumni. Some of which I would be really curious to know whether any of them suffered through one of my classes, but they can drop that in the Q&A later. What the experience is like. Let me start my tool. Okay. So tonight's talk, I thought I'd give a presentation about at least a question that plagues me, if not plagues other people, which is what happened to that kid we used to be. You can flip the question to ask, am I the same person as I was when I was a child? To what extent do you see kind of continuity in who we are from the time we're born to the other ages of life, which we'll talk about a little bit. And so that's the topic I'll be working on. Who am I? You've already got the introduction of the titles and stuff. I'm a personality psychologist by training, and that means that my focus is on how each of us is unique, and in what ways we differ reliably, and how those differences matter, and then more importantly, how we get those differences. How do we arrive, for example, at the age of 18 with a personality sitting in a lecture hall at the U of I, and then what happens to us afterwards? So I'm assuming most of you are afterwards at this point, like me. I study personality development. That's my main topic of research. And that means I look at how and why personality changes over time and at different ages. So the crux of most of my research is there this signal that we can see across the life course that's you, that's the unique signature, and are there ways that you change and develop, and why? And what are the types of experiences you might have that will make you the person you are? We do a lot of longitudinal studies, and that is a very specific type of study where we track people over long periods of time. And it's a relatively odd career in some respects. You have to live a life to be able to study lives. Thankfully, there's lots of people who do this now, and so there's lots of data, but we really like to be patient, so to speak, and watch people for a long time to see what happens to them. These are some examples of some studies. So we just did this study a few years ago, 50-year longitudinal study looking at people from high school until their 60s. We do studies, for example, asking whether the differences that we have when we're young matter to the life we lead afterwards, to people who have different experiences because of the personality they had when they're young. And then we do very big review papers where we try to really characterize the patterns of continuity and change across the life course. And this is a paper that I'll come back to because it helps us with some of the data that I'll be showing you today. I wanted to start with a poll. This is a system that I use in my undergraduate classes now called Mentimeter, and it is a way to figure out where we're at. And so I kind of wanted to know, based on your opinion, whether you think you're the same person you were when you were a child. I'm not going to characterize it or qualify it just with that question. And so the way to do it is you use your phone and use the QR code, or you go to that website, and you will be given the opportunity to fill out a survey. Let's see if it comes up. Aha, there we go. The pre-survey we did was a little more unanimous. Everybody said yes, but this is wonderful. So here you see, look at that. People are coming in and voting. That's nice. It's going up and down. 52. Okay. We have close to 150 people. So a little more. Oh, interesting. Interesting. Okay. So it looks like we've stabilized at no. That's fascinating. Okay. So that's a good thing to know. About half, a little less than half of you say, look, I'm the same person as I was when I was young. The other half of you say, no, I'm a different person. So this could be fun. This is an interesting group. Okay. Okay, there'll be another survey. Let me see if I can get this to go. Oh, nope. Okay. So why might we think we're the same as we were when we were young? One of the reasons why is because the idea that we're the same as we were when we were kids is embedded in our culture. And so I'm going to force you back to your freshman rhetoric classes a little bit, and spark those memories of those wonderful English classes where you read things like Chaucer and Dickens and the like. And so this is William Wordsworth, who wrote this poem, which is used often to indicate why people might think, or let's say hope, they're the same as they were young. It reads, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." So this poem is often alluded to when we ask this question. That quote, "the child is father of the man," is often used by people who are trying to make the argument that your start and the way you were as you were a kid is really the thing that predicts who you're going to become. And that is part of our culture, at least in the Western canon. There are other places where it shows up. So another freshman class you might have taken and read Dickens, his book Great Expectations. The character Pip, to spark your memory, was a boy of modest means. He wasn't from the gentry or the upper class in the English world. And when he was a young child, was faced with a dilemma. He came across a criminal who was in need of help. And the choice he made at the time, which was seen by him and others as a moral choice, was whether to do an act of kindness and help the man, or to turn him in. And he decided to be kind and to help the individual. Life goes on. Pip grows up. He befriends some people in the upper class. He gets entry into the gentry of English society because of an anonymous benefactor who gives him a lot of money so he can then wear the nice clothes and become a refined individual. And then later on, is faced with the same dilemma to help an individual who is not of the upper class, who is a criminal, and he decides to do the same thing again, only to find out that the anonymous benefactor he has is actually the criminal. And so it's a nice story because it illustrates this idea that at our core, we keep these features that mark us even from childhood into adulthood. course, you've got Harry Potter, who's not real, but is a nice example of an idea where, the poor lad got a chunk of an evil lord stuck in his psyche when he was a baby, and had to actually get killed to get rid of it. And he lived a life where he was manifesting that as he was going through. So another kind of allusion to this. Um, then there's Aunt Susie. Aunt Susie is, of course, an icon for my aunt. And I always like to keep myself grounded when it comes to my work and what's going on. So always have conversations with them because they're not academics and they're not researchers. So I asked my Aunt Susie, that's not a real name. So what do you think? Do you think we're the same as we were when we were kids? And her response, without missing a beat, was like the 44% of you. Says, of course we are. I'm absolutely confident that there's no question we are the same as we were when we were young. And I was like, okay, I was impressed with the confidence. It was really quite good. Um, so culturally speaking, the idea is there. It's embedded within our culture. It's been there for many, many centuries. What do the psychologists have to say about this topic? Well, this is Sir Sigmund Freud, who you might remember from another class or two. We don't teach Dr. Freud anymore, at least I don't. And I don't think many people do in the psychology department, because most of his ideas didn't, of course, pan out. That said, he has been and was easily one of the most influential intellects in the field of psychology. He kind of started the modern field of psychology, and his ideas were really, really important to kind of setting up the field and setting up, let's say, our focus. And if you might remember, he had a very provocative idea of development, and personality. And he went so far as to say your personality is made up of three structures: your id, which is your impulses, your desires, and the infant is born all id and just wants things, food, sleep, whatever it might want. And then it has to figure out how to get those things from the world, so it develops its ego. And then eventually you realize that just asking for it isn't going to happen, so you have to kind of join society in some way. And to do that, you have to acquire the superego. And if you remember, of course, his argument was we acquire our superego by overcoming our desire to kill our father and marry our mother by interjecting our father's values and then acquiring a superego. Fascinating story. You got to give it to him for being creative. Absolutely no developmental data to support it, but nonetheless, um, it set us up as a field to really focus in on childhood, and to think that development happened very early in life and our personality was set very early in life. And in his argument, basically your personality was fixed by age 5, and everything after that was window dressing. And so, yeah, it might, yeah, be a bit extreme, but it is what kind of got us started. You see the same ideas manifest now. So this is a very recent book on the experience of trauma. And this is a book which argues that the experience of trauma when you're very young, you might not remember it, you might not feel it in terms of your psychological experience, but it is in your body. And so, which is kind of like the Harry Potter idea, right? You have the experience and it scars you permanently. And that's something that sticks with you throughout your life. If you look at developmental science, you see the same kind of obsession with early childhood. About 10 years ago, the argument was the first 1,000 days are critical. Now we've moved to the second 1,000 days. Either way, that's still the first 2,000 days, which is pretty much what Freud was talking about, right? The 0 to 5, 0 to 10. And you see UNESCO's argues that early childhood is the most critical time. Harvard says it's the critical launching period for the life course. So as a field, psychology, and especially developmental psychology, prioritizes childhood as the locus or the crucible for the way we develop. And so it kind of lends itself to the same kind of idea that we see in the modern culture, that, if you're going to try to figure out, who that person was when you were 5, it's very much the same person as you are now, because that period of the life course is critical for the way you develop. Um, it's culture, and those are ideas. Like a good Midwest scientist at the U of I like data and I prefer data. And so, what I'd like to do is engage you on this question of what the data say, because the data, of course, might say something different. In this case, we need really, really particular and rare data. It's an unusual study that starts with an assessment of kids. So if you wandered through the psych department when you were at the U of I, you know we've got a whole floor dedicated to developmental scientists, and they study 0 to 10. And those people don't work with people like me who study adults. And so you get a lot of people studying kids, but you don't necessarily follow them. But you have to start with an assessment of kids. Then you got to follow them for a long time. You got to follow them into adulthood, at the very least, because that's the only way you could address the question of what happened to that kid that I used to be. And that's a really unusual type of study to do. It is often only at a very broad policy level that you see these types of studies being created by countries or states or cities that are interested in this type of development. So you don't see it very often. And you also have to measure things in a way that you can kind of compare, kids to adults, which is another interesting challenge. So that sets us up for some terminological issues. So I'll spend a little time talking about terminology to familiarize you with some of the concepts that we use and how we might link them together if we get the opportunity to do these types of studies. The first is temperament. So the people who study childhood individual differences or childhood personality usually call what they study temperament. We, as adult researchers, often study things we call personality or personality traits. We have to figure out what we mean by time. We have to characterize things in terms of age, and then we have to really wrestle with what we mean by what's the same. So we want to be able to address that question I asked you at first. Who's right? Is it the people who say they're the same, or is it the people who say they're not? Um, okay, this is the world of temperament. So the definition of temperament is pretty straightforward. It's a constellation of inborn traits that determine a child's unique behavioral style and the way he or she experiences and reacts to the world. So at this point, psychologists don't believe that people start as blank slates. We all start with what you might think of as starting values. That you are born and you do react to the world differently than other children, and that's totally normal. These dimensions that you see, activity level, sensitivity, persistence, distractibility, are all examples of concepts that developmental scientists will assess in kids, and they'll call them temperament. And kids vary in these. They can be more or less intense. They can have more or less positive affect. They can be more or less adaptable. The kid that can be taken anywhere and doesn't cry versus the kid that needs everything to be set and have the same time. These are all the dimensions of temperament that people study. My dog is barking at me. I apologize. Personality traits, on the other hand, are defined as a person's collection of interrelated behavioral, cognitive, and emotional patterns that comprise their unique adjustment to life. Basically the same thing, but just adult form. We organize them differently. So we organize them in what we call the Big Five. For the undergraduates, we do the acronym of OCEAN, so you can remember it on the multiple choice test. And so O is openness, and on the high end of openness are individuals who are imaginative and spontaneous. People on the low end tend to be a little more concrete and less spontaneous, so to speak. Conscientiousness on the high end is being organized, responsible, and industrious. On the lower end, being impulsive and disorganized. Extroversion on the high end is being sociable and assertive and fun-loving, and on the low end, reserved and shy. Agreeable is being trusting and helpful on the high end, and suspicious and possibly uncooperative on the low end. And neuroticism, which is the only negatively keyed one, is being anxious, pessimistic, maybe a little worrying at the high end, and at the low end, being calm and collected. And so that's the Big Five. We organize our world in those five bins. It helps us to do our work. And fortunately, some of my colleagues have done the work to link up the Big Five to those temperament dimensions. So we know, for example, from other research that kids who are active and adaptable tend to be more open when they're adults. Kids who are more persistent and less distractible tend to be more conscientious. Kids who are active and are happy, have a lot of positive mood, they tend to be more extroverted when they're adults. Positive mood and being not reactive to others is related to being agreeable. And then kids who are experiencing more negative affectivity when they're young are more likely to score higher in neuroticism. So we've linked up these things. So they're kind of the same, but you have to do some work to do that. Time is, of course, an issue. Am I the same person I used to be as a child? Requires that you look at least across a few decades, right? There are lots of developmental studies. It's relatively easy. It's easier to do short-term developmental studies where you follow people for a year. We're not really interested in that. We're really interested in studies that go out a few decades. And then there's age, of course, and developmental scientists carve up the life course mostly focused on childhood. You've got newborn infants, babies and toddlers, 0 to 3, children, 5 to 10, tweens, as we put it now, or pre-tweens, the 10 to 12 period when they're in middle school, teenagers, that wonderful institution between 13 and 19. The wide expanse of adulthood, which you're all in now, starts at 19 and doesn't end until you're about 60. And those of us who are over 60 are now enjoying the elderly phase of life, so to speak. And so we have these different age periods. And obviously, in this case, we're really interested in that top row. What do you like when you're a baby, a toddler, or a child? And does that say anything about the way you are when you're an adult? So, and we could ask questions about whether I often have been told that I have yet to grow up, and I'm happy with that. But nonetheless, we could all ask ourselves whether we are adults at some point. But we'll take chronological age as the indicator that you've reached adulthood. And then what effect does age and time have on us as we grow older? And I'll come back to that in a bit. Okay, so now we're at the question of sameness, and we have another poll. So how do we define being the same? As you might know and be aware of, as scientists, we use lots of statistics and we use lots of numbers that are not necessarily intuitively appealing. And so for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to use a metric that I hope is a little more intuitive. Um, and so let me characterize it this way. So this is the way I often ask my students. So think of yourself looking in the mirror this morning, and not your physical features, but think of the psychological features that you see in that person that you look at in the mirror. In 10 years, what's the likelihood that you're going to see the same person? Yeah, and really see the same person psychologically speaking. And so that becomes an odds question. And if it's totally random, who are you going to see in 10 years? Then it's a 50-50 chance you'll see the same person, right? It's a flip of a coin. And then the question becomes, is 60-40 the same or different? Is 70-30 the same or different? Is 80-20? Is 90-10? And so if you highlight that QR code, you'll get the opportunity to vote in this one. How would you describe being the same? Is 70-30 sufficient? Is 60-40 sufficient? Is 80-20 necessary? What's your position on how we should define sameness? Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is very, very similar to every audience I've given this poll to. So from our perspective, when it comes to odds, you want a high chance for things being the same, right? And so something like 60-40, that's not, you you don't want to invest in that mutual fund, right? And 70-30 doesn't seem to be modifying, but 80-20, that resonates with most people. That's being forgiving in the sense that it doesn't have to be perfectly the same, but pretty probabilistic that you're going to be the same. 90-10, that's being doctrinaire. You're being too extreme. So 80-20 seems to always be the vote. That's great. Thank you for your vote. See if I can get past this. Okay, so let's talk about some of the data. This is a very typical study. In fact, this is one of the first studies that actually bothered to do this type of analysis. And it was done by some colleagues. And in this study, they measured temperament in childhood, just like I showed you with those dimensions. They measured whether kids were under controlled versus over controlled. That's kind of conscientiousness. Whether they are inhibited, shy versus outgoing, so to speak. That's extroversion. And whether they were emotionally stable versus neurotic or feeling a lot of anxiety. And that's neuroticism. And so they measured those at age 3. They measured personality traits in adulthood using the Big Five, and then they linked them up from age 3 to age 26. So we didn't do self-reports on the kids. We did staff ratings of temperament at age 3, and then participants rated themselves at age 26, and then they linked those up. So this is like a perfect study. And this is the kind of study we need. And so it does exist, which is great. There are some other studies, and this study, which I alluded to before, which is our big meta-analysis, where we recruited hundreds and hundreds of studies and examined how consistent and how changeable people were, allowed us to dig out the remaining studies. So this has hundreds of longitudinal studies, and we can use this data to not only ask the question of continuity, but also change, which I'll talk to you about. And so we have 8 studies that link childhood to adulthood, using 2 decades as a definition of adulthood, and using childhood as the period from 0 to 10, and adulthood being something 19 and beyond. And then we have hundreds of studies from the rest of the life course to make estimates about how consistent or changed people are. So here's your data, as opposed to the cultural norms or my Aunt Susie. So what are the odds of you being the same? What happened to that kid that you were? Who was right? Was it the people who said they're the same, or the people who said they're different? It was the people who said they're different. So the odds of guessing who you were going to be from how you behaved when you were 0 to 5 is 55-45. It's a very, very small signal, and not very telling. Does it get better when you go on to age 5 to 10? No, it doesn't. So if you look at our childhood and we look at who we become afterwards, and you look back now, it's more the case that you're different than you'd say. Gets a little better when you talk about your teen years, but it's still not great. Then for the confession here, for people like me who maybe weren't at their peak when we were adolescents, which is an understatement, it's probably a good thing that the odds are only 60-40, because looking back, I'm embarrassed by some of the things I did. When you get to college period, like looking back at yourself as a U of I student, what's the probability that you would see the same person in 10, 15, 20 years? 65-35. So you're starting to solidify things a little bit. 25-35, you get up to 70-30, and you only get up to 80-20, which is your definition of sameness, when you talk about folks in their 50s. So by your definition, and by the data, we are not the same as we were when we were kids, which I think I just anticipated my conclusion. This is what the data mean. We're less the same than different from the child that we remember, which is interesting, right? Half of you about thought you were the same, and half of you said no. This invites the question, why might we still think we're the same? And I think it's an important question to consider, because there are lots of features of human nature and development that I think help answer why some of us might say, oh yeah, I'm totally the same as I was when I was 5. And here are the reasons, which I'll go through quickly: confirmation bias, poor memories, storytelling, bad statisticians, and our own development in age and time. So these are some of the reasons why we might hold on or come to the conclusion, or why my Aunt Susie was so confident that, yeah, of course we're the same. Why might she come to that conclusion? Well, the first is, one of the hallmarks of human nature is confirmation bias. We see this a little too much in the world, and it's a very robust phenomenon, as you might know. We like information that fits with our preconceived notions of the world. So when we are asked, "Are you the same?" our propensity would be to look for examples of how we are the same, and not look for examples of how we are not the same. And if we find information either in ourselves or in our siblings or in our parents or in our kids that match, our tendency is to weight that information higher than disconfirming information. And this runs throughout the rest of the examples in an important way. The second reason is, I hate to break it to you, some of you who are my age know our memories are not very good. Humans are not computers. We're not built to record history in a veridical fashion where every detail is entirely right. We think we have good memories, but we really don't. And so my cognitive colleagues tell me it's for a good reason, to some degree. For us to adapt to the world, we have to be able to forget, to learn new things, to actually accommodate to what your situation now. It's good to get rid of some things, and that process of forgetting is actually healthy in some ways. But it does mean that we're not very good at remembering things in the past. And we've done some research on this. This is my friends again did a brilliant study, and we've done a couple of these, where within a longitudinal study, they took the sample when they were 18 and asked them, hey, what were you like when you were 3? What were you like when you were 8, when you were 10? And they actually have the data, so they know exactly the way they were. And when they asked people that question and they retrospected and looked back and said, oh, when I was 3, I was like this. Do you know what was the most important predictor of what they said, it was what they were like when they were 18. And we've seen this repeatedly. If you ask somebody now what they were like back then, the answer you're getting is more about what they are now than what they were like before. And so our memory system doesn't work that well. We can't really remember back. And given the opportunity to say something, we use confirmation bias, which is, I'm like this, therefore I must have been like that before. And so we're not very good recorders of history, especially our own. The third reason I think that we might come to this conclusion is that humans, by their very nature, are storytellers. In fact, I think there's a pretty good argument that's been made that our whole memory system is accentuated by telling good stories and by packaging information in stories. And you probably told these stories about yourself and about your loved ones. I like telling stories about my kids. And to tell a story about my eldest daughter when she was young, and I was walking with her in the store, and she was chafing at me telling her what to do. And she said at that point, when she was about 5, "When do I get to tell you what to do?" And I said offhand, "Oh, honey, when I get old, you'll be totally in charge of me." And suddenly it was quiet, and I looked back at her, and she had this smile, little smile on her face, where you could tell she was imagining what it was going to be like to be in charge of me. And I can say with confidence that now that she's 27, there's no person in the world I would rather put my life in her hands than her, because she is very much the one in charge. That's a great story, right? In the sense of there's this continuity between the way she was when she was young and the way she is now. But it's a story. And what happens when we tell stories like that is, as we tell them over and over again, we embellish them a little bit. We get rid of some of the contradictory details. We maybe make it sound more coherent than it is. And then, really importantly, the story itself becomes our memory. And so the story becomes the truth in some respects. And so our storytelling capacity, which is critical for who we are as a species, is another thing that kind of fosters the I think the perspective that we are the same as we were. And then, of course, we're bad statisticians. This is a forgivable offense. You only have an N of one, as we like to say, a single person that you're going to live with for your whole life. You might be married and you're going to have somebody for a long time, but that's an N of two. That is not a study. And even if you include your family members, not enough data to make any judgments on. And even if you have the data, trust me, I've tried to convince people with data, it doesn't work. We like anecdote, and we prefer, of course, the anecdote that fits our preconceived notions, confirmation bias. And so we don't have this sensitivity that comes out of doing a big study in our own head. And so we can't condition our thinking on that. And then finally, our own development becomes an issue. And so this is a figure from that 2022 study. And it's just to show you one thing, which is that the top line is 50-year-olds and how consistent they are over time. The bottom line is 10-year-olds and how consistent they are over time. And you can see that there's dramatic differences between the two groups. So if I'm talking to somebody who's 50, they have the experience of being the same person pretty much for the last 10 years. I talk to somebody who's 10 or 15, it's not the same. So your development has played a significant role in your perception of sameness and difference. And if we ask older people, it's problematic because they've been more consistent. If we ask younger people, we get better data. In addition to that, you get other ways that are important in terms of humans developing. We're a key feature of human nature is that we have neoteny, which is that we're a very, very slow developing species. We're born far more helpless than almost every other species. It takes a tremendous amount of time for us to get on our feet, literally, and to be able to function within our society. So we have lots of growing and lots of learning to do. So our development is the result of lots and lots of things, lots of transactions over time. And there are two features of that I think are important to understand this phenomena of trying to figure out who that kid was. One is the disruption period, and the other is maturation. And I'll illustrate that with this plot, which is from a friend, Chris Soto, who is plotting, in this case, conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is how organized and industrious you are. And in this study, you see two really important things. So age 10 seems to be a cool time, but then, we all become teenagers. And you can see there's quite the plummet when it comes to our functioning. So we all feel a lot less good during that period. And then you see this amazing acceleration that happens in the transition from their teen years into adulthood. And so if you look at a 30-year-old and ask them, tell me what you were like when you were 5, you've got this huge increase in conscientiousness to traverse. You've got this weird pivot. And then you kind of have to look through that to find out who you were. And so our own development, which makes us different people, I think is an impediment to our ability to be able to understand who we were when we were young. These are the remaining big 5, just so you know, because it's always fun to show this stuff. The first one is agreeableness. We get nicer when we're young, and then we stop. And I won't talk about that in this audience because you're all adults. But I do have a more hopeful plot, which is the emotional stability plot, which is the one next to it. This is this one. We see dramatic increases across the life course. My favorite thing to tell my undergraduates is that they have the best ahead of them when it comes to something like neuroticism. They're going to shed it as they get older, and you're going to continue shedding it as you get older, even beyond that. Extroversion tends to be flat with a little bit of lessening as we get older. Industriousness or conscientiousness has this wonderful curvilinear effect, which if some of you are in your retirement years, you appropriately go down on that because you shouldn't be working hard. I hope you're not. Openness has another fascinating pattern where it goes up when we're young and then down again as we age. So all of the big 5 have these really interesting and fascinating developmental patterns that make us different people from when we're young and when we're old. Okay, so I'll finish with 3 thoughts, but two big implications that I want to leave you with. The first is we aren't born that way. And this is also backed up by some of the recent research on genetics. And so there is a constituency in the world that likes to argue that you got your stuff because of your parents' genes. Personality is heritable. Everything's heritable, by the way. It's not a big thing to be heritable. There's a genetic signal in almost everything that we exhibit in human nature. That doesn't mean that you were born with it and you got stuck with it. In fact, given the numbers I just showed you, quite the opposite, right? If there was this genetic signal that you got when you were born that manifest in your early temperament and that made you the person you are now, the hit rate would be 80-20 or 70-30. It wouldn't be 55-45. And so the idea that the die is cast when at conception with these parents or with this time, it just doesn't hold. And so I would invite you to maybe modify that if that's the position you hold. If you're of the opinion then that parents are the most important thing and childhood is the most important thing and socialization is the most important thing in that time, you would also be wrong. Because again, it can't be, right? If what we experience as children creates who we are as adults, then again, we would expect that signal. I mean, we have these arguments about nature nurture, and we often focus on the nurture that happens from 0 to 5, 0 to 10. And I'm not here to say it's unimportant what happens. In fact, I'll say the opposite in some respects. What's problematic is our primary focus on early childhood and childhood as the only time to pay attention. Really, what we probably should be doing is paying attention the entire life course. But this focus on genes and infants and kids being the time is inappropriate given the data that we have. It's more interesting than that. I will finish and let you ask questions with a metaphor. I know at least one person in this audience knows I like to bake bread, and I also like to use bread and bread baking as a metaphor for life and for person. So you're a purveyor of bread, you know that a good bread, a good baguette from France, a good Vulcan bread, which is what you see on the right from Germany, are in part good because of the ingredients that we put into them. High quality flour, good water, salt, a good starter, some yeast. And the Germans, I don't know, I don't think they leave anything out of their bread, to be honest with you. Every possible seed, nut, rye flour, and the like. So you start with really good ingredients, but that's not enough. You have to combine them, and you have to work with them. You have to knead the dough. You have to let it sit and proof for long periods of time. And if you don't, it doesn't develop the character and the flavor that you would otherwise want. And then you have to bake it at the right time and in the right way to get the bread that you want. And I would invite you to think about your personality like that instead of something that you got in childhood, as Wordsworth would say. You're more like a good German bread, complex, multifaceted, the result of being baked now more than what you got when you were young. And you should relish that. And that would be my hope that you would take from this talk, that who you are now is the thing that's important. And maybe the developmental part is not as overwhelmingly important as we might suspect. Okay, thanks for listening. We have some time for questions, and if you have follow-up questions that you are at all interested in longer answers, please feel free to email me. You know where I'm at. I'm at the U of I, usually sitting in my office. So,
Well, thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. We've got a lot of questions coming in. I'm also going to give everyone the caveat that there are a lot of askers who clearly have a much stronger background in psychology than I do, so I will do my best to interpret. But I think while we wait for some of those to come in, I'm going to start with an easy one, which is, what is your favorite kind of bread to make?
oh, sourdough. Pain de campagne, country French loaf, where you have a little bit of whole wheat, but predominantly white. A boule that you slice, and you can use a piece of that toast for every meal possible. I do love baguettes, I do admit that, but they're not, for me, they're not as complex. The German bread always feels right, and it's very healthy. But the flavor of a really good rustic sourdough, yeah, it's my favorite thing.
That's fair. It's a classic. So a little more on topic.
Okay.
One of our listener or our attendees wants to know what is thought about place and personality development, and by that they mean something like being raised in a
Yes,
rural versus
rural urban.
urban environment.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of, I mean, I'll give a general blandishment when it comes to some of these factors. I just said this last night in a salon that I was in. Um, it- from what we are seeing, and we're trying to figure out what are the big answers to why we end up being the people we are. So we're looking at birth order, socioeconomic background, parenting practices, and these things. And the general rule seems to be that these big things all have small effects, and they all combine. And so there are obviously going to be differences in terms of how growing up in a rural setting versus an urban setting is going to affect you. The people and the places are different. The values and the places are different. But when it comes to our personality, it doesn't have a huge effect. And a lot of the effects are what we call selection effects. Different people move to different places and stay there. And different people move away because they chafe at being in the rural setting, or they don't like the big city, whatever it might be. And so the metaphor I often use in this case is a tapestry. That all these big things, like where we grew up, how our parents treated us, whether we had a brother or sister, they're threads in a tapestry. You're the tapestry. And these big things, they're not magic bullets. They don't explain us. Your birth order doesn't have enough of an impact to define who you are, but it might have woven a thread into who you are now. And the generalization would be something like geographic location is going to be like that. There are some fascinating differences on geographic location, but they're small.
Another person wants to know who struggles more at midlife, those who think they're the same person they were in childhood, or those who think they are different. Do you have any advice for folks who are struggling?
I have absolutely no idea. It's a great question. I mean, so I just started asking the question whether we're the same in midlife, and I haven't thought to ask people and see what it's related to. Thank you for providing an idea for the next honor student study that I'll suggest to my lab, because that's a fascinating study. I have no idea. Um, is it healthier to see yourself change and develop, or is it better to see continuity? I don't know. Usually, continuity in this case wins. So in some other types of analogous studies where we look at things like your changeability isn't necessarily a good thing. So emotional stability is the flip of neuroticism. So neuroticism is emotional instability. If you're unstable, you're changing more. So we know from that perspective that changeability isn't good. But your question is different. It's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it.
So stay tuned. Maybe we'll have a follow-up presentation someday. One person asked, in your opinion, do you feel like people are excited by the possibility of changing their identity, or do folks feel like that is stressful or another emotion?
It's a wonderful question, because one line of research that we've, let's say, carved into recently is actually changing people's personalities. So we've been doing intervention studies and piggybacking on work by our clinical colleagues, And the big surprise there was you can change your personality. And going to see a therapist does quite a remarkable job of improving your neuroticism, for example. And we've done other studies where we said, hey, you want to change conscientiousness? We'll give you a lesson plan. And we succeed. And the reaction to that has been fascinating, right? So some people get really, really frightened by the prospect of changing someone's personality. Part of that is the expectation that it doesn't change. And part of that is the idea that each of us is unique in our individuality. Um, I'm agnostic to that in some respects, and and having hopefully improved my personality in a few ways, probably are just fine with changing. But other people who have better personalities might chafe at the prospect of doing so. But from a data perspective, it's clear we do change. It's clear we can change people and we can change ourselves. But then you have to kind of reconcile that on a personal basis about how you feel about it. I've got lots of friends who are quite opposed to the idea of changing their own or other people's personality just because they feel like your personality is kind of precious. It is you. It is the unique you. And I will say that, like, even when we're improving your neuroticism, we're not changing you into a new person. We're making things a little bit better. And then there are people who fear the more global implication, like we're going to make all kids automatons by making them all, conventional hard workers who don't question things. Right? I've had some colleagues come back with those arguments. So there are different reactions to this idea, and there are individual differences. And so some people don't mind it. I like to make the argument that, um, and this is true for those of us who have wanted to change our personality, you know, I think if you really do want to, you should be given the opportunity to. We shouldn't limit them in that respect. And I've had lots of friends and colleagues, and myself at times, who are suffering the consequences of our personalities. This is especially true with people with substance use disorders and all, like, and they know it, and they want to get better. And far be it for me to be able to tell them, look, I'm philosophically opposed to you changing your conscientiousness. So for those folks, I think there's absolutely no argument against doing that. For the people who would then use it to further abuse our kids in school by making some kind of arms race to make them all perfect in terms of their personality as well as their achievement tests, that's problematic. And we should probably think a few strong thoughts before doing that. So I think it's a relatively complex space, but I think the prospect of having it there should be considered.
Well, you've answered this a little bit, but I think to talk on this thread a little bit more, we had one person ask, what advice do you have for someone who wants to change an aspect of their personality?
Let's start by seeing a therapist. I mean, they're not necessarily engaged with that directly, but you can find very particular therapists, especially the ones who practice cognitive behavioral therapy. Yeah, and some of them are quite facile with techniques and strategies that can lead to good change, and help you through that process. You really do want a coach or a guide. I mean, part of the problem I think in most of our world is we really want people to change, often our spouses or our partners, right? But we don't have the tools other than yelling at them. And that's not a way to get somebody to change. And same is true, of course, for our work relationships. We don't do a very good job of helping people change. Therapists are good, well suited for this. A good coach, which is often only the privilege of the wealthy. There are those who are out there and consulting that do this, leadership coaches and the like. Those folks are working on your personality, and they're great, and they work with you over months and weeks to help you with these things. And that's where I'd go at first. There are techniques and strategies. If you go to my colleague Nate Hudson's website, he's at SMU. Yeah, he's got a self motivated change platform that you can participate on, and it gives you things to practice each day or each week to help you change. And it's I liken it to Duolingo, which if I'm on day I think 1400 myself, and I still can't speak German, which is, let's say, a lesson for you if you're going to try to change your personality, is probably like that. The effort is probably laudable, and good. There's a recent book by a wonderful author, Olga Kazan, called "Me But Better," which is a great title, in which she spent a year trying to change her personality. And it's hilarious, it's poignant, it's touching, and there's some really nice strategies. So if you want to become more extroverted, try some acting classes or comedy classes. Oh my gosh, I don't think I'm brave enough to do that. But if you really want to learn how to get out there, there are things you can do. Her book's a great way to access some of those things.
Well, thanks. I think those are some great tips for folks. And I too, I don't know that I would have the courage to do a comedy class. Um,
And then
switching
write
gears a
about it.
little. Switching gears a little, we got a lot of questions kind of about your research and kind of methodology. So one person asked, have you ever used diaries or journals that research subjects have consistently kept for years to support your research?
Yeah, no, we do qualitative work a lot as let's say, in conjunction with what we do. We don't usually do diaries. We do open-ended interviews of people. So we talk to people about um, their change and their experience. So I always like to. We did this actually with the very first longitudinal study we did. It was on Berkeley students. We were told as graduate students we should not do a longitudinal study, so we did, and we asked the students, after 4 years, how has your personality changed? And they wrote long essays for us, and the wonderful stories, and kind of it reflecting kind of this tension between thinking of personality as something that doesn't change and something that does. My favorite answer on that was one who said, "My personality hasn't changed at all. I have become more extroverted. I work harder, and I'm much less neurotic than I used to be. But my personality is exactly the same." And you're like, "Wait a minute." So yeah, we do try to complement or supplement the more numbers based stuff with qualitative material.
You had showed the one, I started to ask this earlier, so apologies if it's repeating a little bit.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
had showed the
yeah,
one graph that showed how the five different items kind of
yeah,
change
yeah,
over
yeah,
time.
yeah,
And one person specifically asked, why does openness go down as we age, and is that a bad
yeah.
thing?
Well, if you like it, of course, it's bad. But openness doesn't have as much functional relevance to our lives as some of the other domains. Conscientiousness and emotional stability are the big two in terms of relationships and health and the like. Openness is largely related to our hobbies and our political attitudes, and it's not so much related to our functioning, so to speak. There are a lot of psychologists who think that it's the ideal to be high in openness. Um, if you think about it from the vantage point of creativity, it's the strongest precursor to creativity. And so it would be bad, if your goal is to have more older people who are creative, it's probably not conducive to that. But we often emphasize creativity in young people.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we hope to see you again on November 12th for our next webinar. Thanks everyone.